On the night of March 19, 2003, the sky over Baghdad turned orange. The Americans called it shock and awe. It was a military spectacle designed to terrify. Cruise missiles screamed through the darkness. Bunker-buster bombs shook the earth. The presidential palaces of Saddam Hussein exploded in fireballs that could be seen from space. On CNN, embedded journalists narrated the destruction in real time, their voices filled with a mix of awe and dread. The world was told this was a war of necessity. Iraq, they said, possessed weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, biological weapons, perhaps even nuclear weapons. Saddam Hussein, the dictator who had gassed his own people, was a threat to global security. He had to be stopped. The American president, George W. Bush, stood on the deck of an aircraft carrier beneath a banner that read, "Mission Accomplished," and declared that the tyrant had been defeated and freedom was on the march. But there were no weapons of mass destruction. There never were. The inspectors who had combed through Iraq before the invasion found nothing. The intelligence that justified the war was fabricated, exaggerated, and in some cases deliberately falsified. The whole world had been lied to. But the question that haunts history is not whether the war was based on a lie. The question is why. Why did the most powerful nation on earth invade a country that posed no threat? Why did they spend $3 trillion, sacrifice thousands of American lives, and kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqis? The answer is not written in the speeches of politicians. It is written in the contracts signed after the bombs stopped falling. This is the story of the Iraq War. But it is not the story you were told. It is not a story of liberation or democracy or fighting terrorism. It is a story of oil, of greed, of a war launched to control the second largest oil reserves on the planet. It is the story of how a small group of men turned a tragedy into a business opportunity, and how the American taxpayer funded the greatest corporate heist in modern history. To understand the Iraq War, you have to go back to 1991. That was the first time America went to war with Saddam Hussein. The pretext was simple. Saddam had invaded Kuwait, a tiny oil-rich nation on Iraq's southern border. The invasion was a gamble. Saddam believed that Kuwait was historically part of Iraq. More importantly, he believed that Kuwait was stealing Iraqi oil by slant drilling across the border. Iraq had just emerged from a brutal 8-year war with Iran. The war had bankrupted the country. Saddam owed tens of billions of dollars to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, money they had lent him to fight the Iranians. Now those same countries were refusing to forgive the debt. Worse, they were flooding the oil market, driving down prices, and crushing Iraq's ability to pay. Saddam saw the invasion of Kuwait as an economic solution. If he took Kuwait's oil fields, he could erase his debt and control 20% of the world's oil supply. But he miscalculated. The United States, under President George H.W. Bush, saw the invasion as an existential threat, not to democracy, not to human rights, but to the global oil order. If Saddam controlled Kuwait and threatened Saudi Arabia, he would control the pricing mechanism of the entire global economy. He would have leverage over the West. The Americans could not allow that, so they assembled a coalition. They sent 500,000 troops to the Persian Gulf, and in January 1991, they launched Operation Desert Storm. The war lasted 42 days. The Iraqi army was obliterated. The highways out of Kuwait were turned into graveyards of burning tanks and charred corpses. It was a massacre. But crucially, the Americans did not go to Baghdad. They did not overthrow Saddam. They stopped at the border and declared victory. Why? Because the goal was never regime change. The goal was control. By leaving Saddam in power but crippled, the United States maintained a strategic balance in the region. Saddam would be too weak to threaten his neighbors, but strong enough to act as a counterweight to Iran. But the war had unintended consequences. After the invasion, the United Nations imposed the most comprehensive sanctions regime in history on Iraq. The sanctions were designed to prevent Saddam from rebuilding his military. But in practice, they strangled the entire Iraqi economy. Medicine was banned. Food imports were restricted. The infrastructure of the country collapsed. By the mid-1990s, UNICEF estimated that over 500,000 Iraqi children had died as a direct result of the sanctions. When asked about this on national television, the U.S. Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked if the deaths were worth it. She replied, "We think the price is worth it." But the sanctions had another effect. They locked Iraq's oil out of the global market. Under the Oil for Food program, Iraq was allowed to sell limited amounts of oil, but the revenue had to be used to buy humanitarian supplies under UN supervision. Saddam hated this system. It humiliated him. It turned Iraq into a beggar state, and more dangerously for the West, he began to look for ways to break free. In 2000, Saddam made a decision that would seal his fate. He announced that Iraq would no longer accept US dollars for its oil sales. Instead, Iraq would demand payment in euros. This was not just a symbolic gesture. It was an economic threat to the foundation of American power. Since the 1970s, the global oil trade had been conducted exclusively in US dollars. This arrangement, known as the petrodollar system, gave the United States enormous leverage. Every country in the world needed dollars to buy oil. This created constant demand for the dollar, which kept its value high and allowed the U.S. government to print money without triggering inflation. The petrodollar system was the hidden engine of American dominance. If major oil producers started accepting euros or yen or gold, the demand for dollars would collapse. The U.S. economy would be in crisis. Saddam's decision to switch to the euro was a direct attack on this system. If Iraq succeeded, other oil producers might follow. Iran was already talking about it. Venezuela, under Hugo Chavez, was considering it. The dollar's monopoly on oil was under threat. Saddam had to be stopped. Then came September 11, 2001. The terrorist attacks on New York and Washington killed nearly 3,000 people. The nation was traumatized. The public was terrified, and the men who had been waiting for an opportunity to invade Iraq saw their chance. These men were known as the neoconservatives. They were a group of ideologues who had been pushing for regime change in Iraq since the 1990s. Their leader was Paul Wolfowitz, the Deputy Secretary of Defense. Their plan was laid out in a document called the Project for the New American Century. The document argued that the United States needed to maintain its dominance through military strength. It called for the overthrow of hostile regimes in the Middle East, starting with Iraq. But before 9/11, this plan was politically impossible. The American public had no appetite for another war. After 9/11, everything changed. Within days of the attacks, Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, was telling his aides to find a way to link Iraq to the attacks. There was no link. Saddam Hussein was a secular dictator who hated Islamic extremists. Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, had called Saddam an infidel. But the truth didn't matter. The administration began a propaganda campaign to convince the public that Iraq was a threat. They claimed that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. They claimed he was developing nuclear weapons. They claimed he had ties to al-Qaeda. Vice President Dick Cheney went on national television and said with absolute certainty that Saddam had chemical and biological weapons. Secretary of State Colin Powell went to the United Nations and presented intelligence that he claimed proved Iraq was hiding weapons. The intelligence was wrong. Some of it was based on testimony from a source code named Curveball, an Iraqi defector who later admitted he had made it all up. Some of it was based on forged documents, like the infamous claim that Iraq was trying to buy uranium from Niger. But the media repeated the lies. The public believed them. And in March 2003, the invasion began. The war was supposed to be quick. The Pentagon predicted that American troops would be greeted as liberators. They predicted that Iraq's oil revenue would pay for the reconstruction. They predicted that the war would cost $50 billion. They were wrong on every count. The initial invasion was swift. Within 3 weeks, American tanks rolled into Baghdad. Saddam's statue was toppled in front of cheering crowds. President Bush stood on an aircraft carrier and declared victory. But the war had just begun. The United States had invaded Iraq with no plan for what came next. The U.S. Administrator Paul Bremer made 2 catastrophic decisions. First, he dissolved the Iraqi army, putting 400,000 trained soldiers out of work and angry. Second, he banned all members of Saddam's Ba'ath Party from government positions, which meant that everyone who knew how to run the country was excluded. The result was chaos. The electricity went out, the water stopped running, the hospitals had no medicine, the government collapsed, and the men with guns, the former soldiers and Baathists, joined the insurgency. Iraq descended into a civil war. Sunni and Shia militias battled each other in the streets. Al-Qaeda moved into the power vacuum and began a campaign of suicide bombings. American soldiers, who had been told they would be home by Christmas, found themselves trapped in an urban nightmare. The death toll climbed. 500 Americans dead, 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, and the Iraqi death toll was far worse. Conservative estimates put the number of Iraqi civilians killed in the war at over 500,000. Some studies suggest the number is closer to 1 million. Entire cities like Fallujah were leveled. Millions of Iraqis fled the country. It was a humanitarian catastrophe, but for a small group of American corporations, it was a gold mine. The man at the center of this gold mine was Dick Cheney. Before becoming vice president, Cheney had been the CEO of Halliburton, a massive oil services company. Halliburton made its fortune building infrastructure for oil companies and the military. When Cheney left Halliburton to join the Bush administration in 2000, he received a severance package worth $34 million, but he maintained financial ties to the company. He still received deferred compensation. He still owned stock options. This was a clear conflict of interest. But it didn't stop him from steering billions of dollars in government contracts to his former company. In 2003, Halliburton subsidiary Kellogg Brown & Root, KBR, received a no-bid contract worth $7 billion to provide logistical support for U.S. troops in Iraq. No bid means there was no competitive process. The Pentagon simply handed the contract to Halliburton without asking anyone else. Over the course of the war, Halliburton would receive over $39 billion in government contracts. The company made enormous profits, but the work was shoddy. Government auditors found that Halliburton had overcharged the military by hundreds of millions of dollars. They billed the government $45 for a case of soda. They charged $100 to wash a bag of laundry. In some cases, they billed for services that were never provided. Trucks were driven across Iraq empty, just to run up the mileage charges. One internal Pentagon audit found that Halliburton could not account for $1.8 billion in spending. The money had simply disappeared, but there were no consequences. No one was prosecuted. The contracts kept flowing, because the war was not being run by the military or the State Department. It was being run by the corporations, and the corporations were making a fortune. But Halliburton was not the only company cashing in. The reconstruction of Iraq was supposed to cost $50 billion. In reality, the United States spent over $60 billion on reconstruction alone, and most of that money went to American contractors. Bechtel received $2.3 billion to rebuild Iraq's infrastructure. Much of the work was never completed. Power plants that were supposed to be fixed remained broken. Water treatment facilities that were supposed to be built were never started, but the money was gone. Then there were the private military contractors. Companies like Blackwater were hired to provide security for American officials and convoys. These contractors were paid far more than U.S. soldiers. A private contractor could make $1,000 a day, while a U.S. soldier made $50. At the height of the war, there were more private contractors in Iraq than there were U.S. troops. These contractors operated outside the law. They were not subject to military justice. They were not subject to Iraqi law. They were accountable to no one. In 2007, Blackwater contractors opened fire on a crowd of civilians in Baghdad's Nisour Square, killing 17 people, including women and children. It was a massacre. But the contractors were not prosecuted in Iraq. They were eventually tried in the United States, but only after years of legal wrangling. The message was clear. In Iraq, American corporations could do whatever they wanted. But the ultimate prize was the oil. Iraq has the second largest proven oil reserves in the world, over 140 billion barrels. Before the war, Iraq's oil industry was nationalized. It was controlled by the government. Foreign companies were not allowed to own Iraqi oil. This was unacceptable to the oil majors. ExxonMobil, Chevron, BP, and Shell had been locked out of Iraq since the 1970s when Saddam nationalized the industry. The Iraq War was their chance to get back in. In the first years after the invasion, the plan was to pass a law in Iraq that would open the oil sector to foreign investment. The U.S. administration pressured the Iraqi government to pass the Iraq Oil Law, which would allow production sharing agreements with foreign companies. But the Iraqi parliament resisted. They understood that signing away their oil was signing away their sovereignty. The law never passed, but the oil companies found another way. By 2008, with Iraq still in chaos, the Iraqi government was desperate for revenue. The insurgency was draining the budget. They needed to increase oil production, so they began signing service contracts with the oil majors. These contracts were technically not ownership. The oil still belonged to Iraq, but the companies were paid to extract it, and the terms were extremely favorable. ExxonMobil, Shell, BP, Total, and others signed deals to develop Iraq's largest oil fields. They made billions. By 2011, when the last U.S. combat troops left Iraq, the mission was complete. Not the mission to bring democracy, not the mission to fight terrorism, but the mission to control Iraq's oil. The fields were back in the hands of Western companies, the contracts were signed, the oil was flowing, and the profits were immense. But the cost was staggering. The Iraq War cost the United States over $3 trillion when you include long-term veteran care, interest on borrowed money, and the economic impact. Over 4,500 American soldiers were killed. Over 32,000 were wounded. Many came home with traumatic brain injuries and PTSD. The suicide rate among Iraq War veterans is epidemic, and the Iraqi people paid an even higher price. Over 500,000 dead, millions displaced, an entire generation traumatized, the country's infrastructure destroyed, and the rise of ISIS. When the United States pulled out in 2011, they left behind a broken state. The Sunni population, which had been empowered under Saddam, was now marginalized. They were angry, they were armed, and they were ready to fight. In 2014, a group called the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, swept across northern Iraq. The Iraq War is the ultimate case study in how modern imperialism works. You don't need to annex territory, you don't need to plant a flag, you just need to control the resources. The United States invaded Iraq under the pretense of security. They sold the war to the public with lies about weapons of mass destruction. But the real goal was always economic. It was about controlling the oil supply. It was about preserving the petrodollar system. It was about opening Iraq's oil fields to Western corporations. And it worked. The oil companies got their contracts. Halliburton and the other contractors made billions. Dick Cheney, who had orchestrated much of the policy, returned to private life a wealthy man. The architects of the war faced no consequences. George W. Bush retired to his ranch in Texas. Donald Rumsfeld wrote a memoir. Paul Wolfowitz became the president of the World Bank. None of them were held accountable for the lies, the deaths, or the destruction. But the American taxpayer paid the bill. $3 trillion. Money that could have rebuilt America's infrastructure. Money that could have funded education and health care. Instead, it was spent on a war that benefited a handful of corporations and left a trail of bodies across the Middle East. The lesson of the Iraq War is that when a government tells you that a war is about freedom, or security, or democracy, you should look at who profits. Follow the money, follow the contracts, follow the oil. Because in the 21st century, wars are not fought for glory or honor. They are fought for resources. And the cost is always paid by the people who have no say in the decision. The soldiers who die, the civilians who are bombed, the taxpayers who foot the bill. While the executives and politicians who planned the war retire to wealth and comfort, the Iraq War was not a mistake. It was not a failure of intelligence. It was a crime committed for profit. And the blood of over 500,000 people is the price that was paid so that a few men could get richer. That is the truth of the Iraq War. That is the price of oil. This is the financial injustice. Subscribe if you want to see how power really moves beneath money.